We're going to talk about Syria today. Now, the fall of Qusayr, which we all saw play out yesterday and the day before, was significant because it's on a trade route, but also it's significant because Hezbollah from Lebanon were involved. We've got guests in Beirut, also at BBC Monitoring and in Scotland, who are going to give us their views on when this conflict became internationalised. Here are our contact details if you'd like to take part. This is the phone number, but all the contacts are going to be on the screen. So wherever you're watching, however you want to get involved, you're very welcome.
My experience.
People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
Now let me introduce you to our first guest. Remember, we are live, so you can respond to anything that they're saying. From BBC Monitoring, we have Faisal Ishaid. We also are joined by Kainan Rahmani from the Syrian American Council, currently on the Turkish-Syrian border, and also Robin Yassin Kassab, a British-Syrian novelist who joins us from Scotland. All three of you, you are very welcome indeed. Kainan, if I could start with you, give us your assessment of the significance of this week in the conflict.
Thank you so much for having me. With regards to the town of Qusayr, we're seeing Hezbollah forces making the most horrific onslaught that we have seen to date in the Syrian conflict, and it represents the greatest spillover into creating the Syrian conflict into a regional conflict. Hezbollah forces surrounded the town of Qusayr for 3 weeks, and the rebels were able to last much longer than anyone expected, and have been able to evacuate many civilians who were trapped in the city. Unfortunately, we still have thousands of families trapped in the city. We have 55,000 IDPs who have been displaced to other cities, and the Assad regime and Hezbollah forces continue to attack those civilians even as they flee to other areas of Syria.
Robin, what about you?
Well, I think it's been it's a very serious point in this conflict. What's happened this week or in recent weeks is that the Assad regime and its international backers, now that includes imperialist Russia, Iran, Hezbollah and Shia extremist militias that are coming in their thousands or tens of thousands from Iraq. These people have all reorganized themselves, rededicated themselves, and with total commitment they're going to they're aiming to take the fight back to the Syrian people, to the resistance, and to try and claw back some land. Now, I don't think this is the turning of the tide. I don't think the regime is going to win. However, if this continues for another 6 months, say, that on the one hand we've got highly organized international forces backing this genocidal regime, and on the other hand, we've got the Arabs and the West dithering and dallying and worrying about Salafists and worrying about this and worrying about that, and not at the end of the day providing any effective help whatsoever to the Syrian people. What we could see is, on the one hand, eventually the regime clawing back control of most of the country, which would be a genocidal disaster of, on an unprecedented scale. And we'll also see an expansion of what we're seeing at the moment, which is a regional sectarian war. This revolution did not start like this, but Bashar al-Assad and his foreign helpers have been very clever, very evil, and also very intelligent in dividing and ruling and turning this into a Sunni-Shia war,
and
which is a disaster
Robin,
for
let me just jump
everybody.
in here. What is interesting, I suppose, is that if your analysis is correct, we could end up with different countries taking different sides in a sectarian war playing out in Syria. And by the way, those of you watching, if you want an indication of the seriousness with which the UN is now taking the humanitarian effort, you probably heard in the news from Tim just then, it's launched its biggest ever humanitarian appeal, looking for $5 billion. It estimates that 10 million Syrians will need help by the end of the year. That's half the Syrian population. Let's go live now to Beirut and speak to Sarah Asaf in Beirut, an activist, half Syrian, half Lebanese. Sarah, what do you feel about the role Hezbollah played in the fall of Qusayr?
We have a big problem in the role Hezbollah is playing, actually, for many reasons. Not just because we feel it's a completely unethical thing they did, but also because this the involvement of Hezbollah in Qusayr is really going to have a lot of consequences on Lebanon. Everybody today is talking about a potential civil war in Lebanon because of Hezbollah's involvement. We were all very much shocked when we heard Hassan Nasrallah say very bluntly in his public speech that Hezbollah is involved in Qusayr, that Qusayr is the battle of Hezbollah today, and it's about the survival of the Shias. So the sectarian war that is happening in Syria today is going to spill into Lebanon, and we're all feeling this. This is mainly how I feel today about that.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much. We'll come back to you in a moment. You're in Beirut. So is Yazan, who's a Syrian who lives there. He participated in World Have Your Say's radio edition a little bit earlier in the week. This is what he has sent in for us to have a look at.
Everyone there is depressed in Syria, especially in Aleppo. Over there, like, there's currently rebels fighting within people's homes, taking homes and everything. Well, the Qusayr side, I think, yeah, as you said, it's a strategic location for Latakia and Tartus, and at the same time for the border with Lebanon. As long as that border is secure, then the rebels will have a hard time taking in Damascus and all the cities around it. But the borders from the north aren't secure, and as you know, the rebels already have hold of it.
Let's pick up on some of the points that Yazan was making. Perhaps first of all with you, Kanan. Do you think there's a risk now that this conflict will be in a stalemate, that it will just go on indefinitely because both sides have sufficient support that the other can't knock them out?
I mean, the support for the rebels is very limited when you compare with the support that the Assad regime is receiving from Hezbollah, from Iran, from Russia, which are continuing to supply weapons irrespective of the Assad regime's refusal to participate in peace negotiations in the past. Unfortunately, with regards to the rebels and the stalemate that the viewer is suggesting, the only way to prevent this war from consuming Syria as the stalemate prolongs is for the international community to put a complete stop on all of Iran and Russia's involvement, and for Lebanon to close the borders for Hezbollah to not be able to participate.
The point is that even if the international community wanted to do that, its ability to stop Russia and Iran offering assistance to President Assad or Hezbollah would be nigh on impossible, wouldn't it? In fact, the reason so many people have beaten a path to President Putin's door is that Secretary of State John Kerry, for instance, understands Russia is absolutely key. Robin, I want to bring you in a moment. First of all, let me just play all of you this. This is a Hezbollah member who was fighting in Qusayr. Abu Ali was interviewed by Mona Alami from a news website in Lebanon. We can just pull this up on the screen for you to see. Hezbollah is leading the operations in Qusayr. The Syrian army is only playing a secondary role, deploying after an area is completely cleaned and secured. And Robin, if we take that to be true, that Hezbollah's role is that integrated, it is hard to see, isn't it, a way that the rebels could defeat the army combined with Hezbollah's might?
Well, you know, when we talk about support, to go back slightly, as the previous commentators said, the resistance, the Syrian people, the revolution has almost no real support. Despite all the rhetoric and so on, it has almost no real support. But what it does have is the force of numbers. This is being presented sometimes as if Syria is split 50-50. Half the people are with the regime, half the people are not. And there are indeed a lot of people who are worried about what's coming next, about the extremism that's been brought up by the traumatization of the country. But it's only a very small minority which is actually supporting the regime. So by force of numbers, I think it will be impossible for the regime to recapture what it's lost, even with the help of the crack forces of Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah, of course, have fought Israel. They didn't actually do as well as we expected them to do in the battle for Qusayr, because Qusayr is actually a very small city. It's a rural city, a small town, really. And it took them weeks to dislodge poorly armed local people. The reason for that is Hezbollah should know this. Hezbollah did very well fighting Israel when Israel invaded Hezbollah's own turf. When Israel came into Lebanon, Hezbollah was very good at defending. Now, here they've gone into the mode of attacking. They've gone into the mode of crossing their border, being aggressive against another Arab people. This, I think, in the long term, this is terrible for the Syrians, but in the long term, it's even worse for Hezbollah. This is Hezbollah, remember, despite them being from the minority Shia sect, which some sectarian-minded Sunnis in the Arab world, they don't like that. But nevertheless, a couple of years ago, Hezbollah was wildly popular throughout the Arab world, including in Syria. In 2006, 1 million Lebanese Shia refugees, Hezbollah's people, if you like, came and stayed in Syria. They stayed in people's houses. It wasn't the Syrian state that looked after those people. It was ordinary people, including in Al-Qasr, because they were very popular.
There's a couple of things here. And first of all, in terms of the popularity of Hezbollah around the Arabic world, we'll be hooking up with BBC Arabic in a moment, so they can give us an insight into that. Sarah, in Beirut, I saw lots of reports on Twitter of people celebrating the fall of Qasr because they were happy about the role that Hezbollah has played. Was that your experience, that most of the people you know approved?
Yes, exactly. In fact, there was a picture from Dahiya that was taken from Dahiya, the southern suburb of Beirut, where that is also a stronghold for Hezbollah. And you could see Hezbollah people celebrating and distributing sweets and firing gunshots in Lebanon just because they were celebrating the fall of Al-Qasr. This picture spread through social media. I mean, it took 2 hours for everyone to see this picture, and it was, after then mediatized on all the traditional media as well. And this picture created even more. I mean, the capture of Qasr in general created even more tensions inside Lebanon between Sunnis and Shias, because for many people, many people tweeted and they were saying that they remember now the May 7 humiliation that Hezbollah inflicted on Sunnis on May 7, 2008. And this is what people today remembered in Lebanon. And this is why suddenly you saw that in Tripoli, clashes started to escalate. You know, 2 days ago in Tripoli, it was not anymore about clashes in a limited area between Bab Tabbane, where the Sunnis are, and Jabal Muhsin, where the Alawites are. But yesterday in Tripoli, there were masked gunmen all over the city, in the city center of Tripoli. And all schools were closed, all colleges were closed. We're starting to see the consequences of this tension between Sunnis and Shias. And the fact that Hezbollah celebrated the capture of Qasr was a big provocation. It was considered as a big provocation for most of the Sunni people in Lebanon.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Well, we're getting a huge response from those of you watching here on BBC World News. Comments coming in from Ghana, Cameroon, Ethiopia, India, Malaysia and Niger. Keep all of them coming. I'll do my best to weave them into the conversation. I can also see that Mari in the UK has tweeted us saying everyone is playing the sectarian game, not just Assad. And certainly a lot of you are concerned that both sides are now interested in dividing this conflict down sectarian lines. Let's just pull up a comment from a piece in the Washington Post by Charles Krauthammer to work into our conversation here on World Have Your Say. For the rebels, it's a devastating loss of territory, morale, and their supply corridor to Lebanon. Everyone knows that Assad now has the upper hand. And Kenan, on the Turkish-Syria border, I wonder if you agree with that it's now harder for the rebels to negotiate the terms of a peace conference, for instance, because, well, they don't appear to be in anywhere near as strong a position as before.
Let's make a few things clear. First of all, the terminology that Qasr has fallen is propaganda that has been promoted by Hezbollah and the Assad regime. The rebels withdrew from Qasr strategically, leaving mines behind, strategically placed, so that they could inflict losses on
hold on, Kenan, let's be clear here.
They are still fights in the area.
Let's be clear. We don't know the circumstances, but we do know, because the rebel commanders have said so. One moment. We do know that they withdrew because they couldn't get enough weapons. They've acknowledged that. Their supply routes were not as good as they thought. So for whatever reason, they withdrew because they weren't strong enough.
And the other thing that has been neglected is that Qasr was expected to have fallen 3 weeks ago. Rebels were able to sustain their lines and inflict major losses on Hezbollah, which no one in the world expected. Not even opposition forces were able to predict that kind of loss. So I do not think that this is the decisive defeat for the rebels that has been promoted and propagandized by the Assad regime and by Hezbollah forces. And certainly the morale here in the north of Syria and along the Turkish-Syrian border reflects that we are continuing the fight. The supply routes are still available. we're still able to continue working. Of course, this represents a strategic defeat in some respects, but it also means that we will, not myself, but as the Syrian opposition, I mean, this will engage the Hezbollah supporters, whether they're in Syria or in Lebanon. And as your guest stated, this is very dangerous for Lebanon that Hezbollah has intervened in.
Well, there are a few things on which everyone agrees, but the fact that Lebanon is very much involved in this conflict is beyond dispute. A couple of comments come in from Norway and the US and Mauritius. This just in from Ishmael, who's in Mauritius. Thanks for watching. He says, I fully agree with Hezbollah's participation in Syria. Everything that the West is doing is null and void. And he's suggesting that the support for rebels is drifting away. Well, it's very difficult to judge that, but certainly the international community still seems keen to offer some forms of support. The exact form that support takes, though, is a key point of discussion. We'll get involved in that and the other issues raised by a very important week in Syria, just after a quick break here on BBC World News.
No, I talking about it. Let me say something.
In a moment, we're going to be tying up with BBC Arabic and BBC Turkish to hear what their viewers are saying about the situation in Syria and the role that Lebanon is increasingly playing in it. First of all, let's bring in a colleague of ours from BBC Monitoring. Faisal Ishaid is live with us from there. And one of the hardest things, Faisal, about this conflict is that the information we get, with the exception of things coming from people like Lise Doucet, is that we're having to make a judgment about it because it comes from one side or the other. And I'm guessing you see that when you look on social media, which is your expertise.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's really hard. We get a lot of information coming out of social media users. And in this particular case, over the last week, we got information coming from Syrian users, Lebanese users, and users from all over the Arab world. And the most important part, or the challenging part, is actually to be able to verify the authenticity of the users. Who do they represent? Is it true that, for example, they represent a political party, a rebel group fighting on ground? So before we actually take their information, we have to make sure that they are genuine accounts, authentic accounts, and that's really, really tricky. For example, in users, we look at certain indicators. How many followers do these users have? Do they have local journalists following them, trying to get information out of them? When was the last time that they tweeted? And what is the content that they are actually talking about? In order for us to be able to verify whether these are whom they say they are. We have relied a lot on social media contribution to be able to see what is happening in Al-Qusayr in particular. For example, we've looked at so many YouTube videos to see if actually the government forces have reached Al-Qusayr. And in here we need to make sure that the location is correct, and we were looking for landmarks. I don't know if you've heard about the clock tower in Al-Qusayr city center. So we were looking at the clock tower when we were getting these videos to see if they actually we are able to see this clock tower and other landmarks in order for us to be able to verify that this information is actually coming from Al-Qusayr city center. Because especially in this particular clash, we got so many reports, so many conflicting reports. Every party was trying to say that we are actually fighting, even after the army, the Syrian army, have declared victory, as they said, and that they had captured Al-Qusayr. We still got information from social media users that are pro-opposition saying that there are still fights going around Al-Qusayr. And I'm not really surprised because, as one of your guests said, Al-Qusayr is quite, we have 30,000 to 40,000 people living in Al-Qusayr. It's more or less, I wouldn't say a big town, but even if the army took over the city center, still it is very possible that there were clashes happening around the city. So it's very important to verify the information that we get before we actually depend on it. And in this particular case, I want to say that throughout the Syrian conflict, it was very important for many news agencies and media outlets to be able to get a conflict map to see who owns what or who captured what, because that was very important. It had a diplomatic and political importance, because both parties, we're talking about the government and the pro-opposition, they can use this information when they go to international conferences as leverage to say that I control, let's say, north of Syria or south of Syria, you should give me support.
I suppose the point about that map is that it's changing every single day, Faisal. It has to be updated.
Absolutely.
Now, let me pull up a couple of the bits of information that you and your colleagues at BBC Monitoring have given to us. This is from the Iranian Al-Alam TV, and it shows these images of a damaged church in Qusayr, and the caption reads, "Return of Al-Qusayr's residents amid destruction caused by the gunmen." And this also from BBC Monitoring, which I can show to you. This is a screen grab of an al-Sharq al-Awsat issue from the 6th of June, and the headline reads, Al-Qusayr in al-Assad's hands and celebration in al-Dahir and Tehran. Well, let's bring in a couple of colleagues now from BBC Arabic and BBC Turkish. We have Rafi Jabori, BBC Arabic, Sheriff Isler from BBC Turkish. Good to see the two of you. Rafi, let me ask you, have people focused on the fact that this church was desecrated in Al-Qusayr, that there is a religious element to this conflict now?
Of course, yeah, of course there is, but the discussion is still surrounded around the city of Al-Qusayr itself, and this how significant was that event, the battle itself. Will it be a turning point? Of course, the coming weeks and months will show that. I have to say that the points of view are very divided. Most likely across most noticeably actually across the sectarian lines, whether in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or even around the Middle East and North Africa.
And what about the reaction from Turkish viewers? I suppose they've got a lot to think about at the moment, haven't they, Sheriff, with all the protests? But what about the story happening across the border?
Well, actually, you're very right in that Turkish people are fully concentrated on what's happening domestically at the moment within Turkey, and social media seems to be a flurry with messages regarding that. However, now one thing that's interesting, this is actually a bit linked, the situation in Syria and what's happening in Turkey domestically, because the protest that's mushroomed around the country, well, one of the protests was taking place in Hatay and Antakya, on the Syrian border, and in this protest, it was the infamous protest where one protester was killed. Now this one, actually the people who had a grievance there with the government, it was because of the twin car bombing and that took place in that city as a result, they believe, as a result of Turkey's foreign policy, where Mr. Erdogan, the Turkish Prime Minister, got involved, almost they feel that he was very involved in the Syrian situation. He was calling for he was thinking that the Assad regime would fall quickly, and as a result of this involvement, when Syrians came in, the twin car bombing took place. This is what the people there believe, and they have always been asking, why are we involved in the Syrian situation so closely?
That's always a debate, isn't it, for any government when there's a conflict across the border? Do we get involved in the name of defence, or do we stay clear in the name of defence? Sarah, just before we let you go, because I know you've only got a minute with us from Beirut, what do you want your government to do now? Do you want it to exert pressure on Hezbollah to cease to be involved? How do you want your government to proceed?
Actually, now we do not have a government in Beirut. We just have a caretaking government, and there's no possibility now to form a government in Beirut because Hezbollah is insisting on being part of the new government, and March 14 forces would not accept to be part of this government because they would be covering Hezbollah if they participate with Hezbollah in this government. So actually, and the caretaking government that is now controlling, I mean, not really controlling, but that is supposedly in charge, most of the ministers in this government are pro-Hezbollah. I mean, we have a foreign minister who yesterday defended Bashar al-Assad in front of the Arab League, and we have who actually justified Hezbollah's involvement.
And let me jump in just because we're near the end of the programme. Thank you for coming in. It is interesting how we should emphasise that Hezbollah's military operation, but also a political operation too. We're going to carry on talking about Syria in just a few minutes here on BBC World News.
Let me say something. Talking about it.
My experience.
People are going to want to know. Let me say something.
Well, Faisal from BBC Monitoring still with us. We'll speak to him again in a moment because it's very interesting to find out the process that all journalists, not just at the BBC, have to go through to establish the quality and the reliability of the information coming out of Syria. Let me just pull up a video for you here that we can have a look at on the screen. This is from Nadal in Homs.
City look like a great prison because of the regime's checkpoints and prefabricated walls, especially at the western entrance of the city. The checkpoints and prefabricated walls divide the city. We barely can go to other neighborhoods, and the military intelligence office arrests the civilians kills them, buries them, and gives their grave number to their family. That is the situation of neighborhoods that are under regime control.
So that's Nadal in Homs. Faisal, let's bring you in from BBC Monitoring. It's interesting as well, isn't it, how the world's media tends to focus on one place, Qusayr, this week, while forgetting there are others still very much bound up in the conflict. How do we go about being sure that what we're hearing there from Homs is correct? I'm not doubting the honesty of that gentleman, but more generally, when we get accounts, what would you do in that situation?
So as I said earlier, when we get, let's say, a video, the most two important things we want to verify is the location and the time of the recording. So when we want to look at the location, we usually look for landmarks. For example, in the case of Al-Qusayr, we were looking particularly searching for the clock tower. It's like the Big Ben of London. It's like the Big Ben of Al-Qusayr. When we received these reports of pro-government forces saying that we actually are in Al-Qusayr, we're looking for these landmarks in order to be able to identify that the location was correct. That's from one point. The other point is the time of the recording. It's really tricky for you to be able to identify or to know that the time of the recording is actually correct. And we use a number of things. For example, let's say they said that the recording happened in June, or let's say in the summer. Unlike England, Syria is a place where it doesn't get rainy in the summer. So if you look at things and they say that this was taken in the summer, and you see that, okay, the weather is not really summery and all that, and you say, okay, then there is something wrong. So there's a number of things that we do, depending on regional expertise and language capabilities, in order for us to be able to verify videos. And just one really interesting point is every part of Syria speaks a certain dialect, just like England. So for example, north of Syria speaks in a different dialect than south of Syria, west and east. So when we listen to these videos, when we watch these videos, and they say, for example, this happened in Homs, the people from Homs have a particular accent. And when we listen to these videos and we say, okay, this does not actually correspond to the information we have, we start questioning the video, questioning the authenticity of the video, and do further investigations for us to be able to verify that whether this is correct or not.
So these are the various checks that you have to run, and I'm sure those of you who are watching are also, this may be ringing bells for you, because while we've been trying to report the protests in Turkey this week, we've had similar challenges. Lots of things have come out of those protests in Turkey, been put onto social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, and they've basically turned out not to be true. So we have to go through these processes to be sure that what we're sharing with you is reliable information. Now, I was mentioning Israel. Let's turn to Israel now and speak to Elizabeth Surkoff, who joins us live. She's a contributor to the website Global Voices. Elizabeth, give us your perspective on what's happened this week. I suppose we're particularly thinking about the invasion of the demilitarized zone by the Golan Heights, which has upset some Israelis. What was your reaction to the week's events?
Well, for the first time, the rebels managed to gain control of the Quneitra crossing, the crossing in the border fence between Quneitra and the part of the Golan Heights that is occupied by Israel. And this caused great kind of resulting great attention to what's happening in Syria and Israel. I personally, I support rebels. I oppose the Assad regime, and I am happy that the rebels are gaining more ground. But many other Israelis are very, very worried about the proximity of the rebels to Israel. But since then, the Assad's forces have entered the demilitarized zone with the APCs and tanks. This is something they're not supposed to do. And they retook the crossing, so now it is back to how things were, and now Assad controls the crossing.
And there's a couple of things we should add. The BBC understands from a number of Israeli sources that Israel is unlikely to act on Syrian troops going into an area where they're not supposed to be. And just to give you a little bit of context, the armistice which set up this demilitarized zone came into play after the 1973 war, and you may have seen that Austria has withdrawn its troops. Those troops have been there for decades as part of the UN force that maintains the demilitarized zone. Well, Austria said it's now getting too dangerous. It wants its troops out, so it's taken out. Japan and one other country are still there, though, so the UN still has maintained a presence. Let's bring in another guest to introduce you to. We are joined now live by Diana Mukhaled, who's a TV journalist in Beirut. Diana, give us your reaction to this week? Were you grateful for Hezbollah's intervention in Qusayr?
I think Hezbollah's intervention in Qusayr is disgraceful. I think what Hezbollah is committing in Syria is a crime, not only for Syrians, but also for Lebanese. Hezbollah is feeding the sectarian feeling and tension, not only in Lebanon, but in the Arab world. He's not only standing beside a tyrant regime, which is Assad, but also using sectarian words and ideology in justifying his war in Syria with the regime. Unfortunately, what happened in Qusayr, what's happening in Syria in general, is something not acceptable for us, Lebanese, for us, for the Shia community in Lebanon, for everybody who's living here. I'm afraid that some analysts are speaking that the Shia in Lebanon will suffer as much as the Germans after the World War II, after what Hitler committed with the Jews. So I'm afraid that Hezbollah is really inflicting on the Shia community, not only in Lebanon, but on the region, a burden that they will suffer from in the coming years or decades,
But Diane, I don't know how useful any comparison with Nazi Germany is, but let's talk about the situation now. Isn't it completely reasonable for Hezbollah to be concerned about the Sunni militants who are coming into Syria, fighting on the side of the rebels, and who have an agenda against Shia Muslims, which Hezbollah ought to be concerned about?
Well, Hezbollah himself, during the American occupation of Iraq, cooperated with the Sunni militants. In 2010, Hezbollah hosted a conference in Lebanon that many of the Iraqi Sunni radical leaders participated in. Well, we all remember that most of the Islamists in Syria today have come from Iraq. And we know, and international community know, that the militant Islam in Iraq they were smuggled through Syria. Syria played a major role in bringing and smuggling fundamentalism to fundamentalists to Iraq. Let's not forget Syrian's role, Syrian regime role in creating these small groups, whether in Lebanon, whether in Syria, whether in Iraq, and even let's not forget about Hamas. So it's a method that is used by Syrian regime from day one. Let's not forget how the...
Well, let's not forget, but let's also not forget that President Assad has not said he supports these groups. He's actually gone and condemned the Sunni militant groups who are fighting against him, saying these are terrorists, they are foreign terrorists, and it's appropriate for the Syrian army to be pushing back against them. But as ever, and we've discussed this with Faisal from BBC Monitoring, there's always more than one narrative. I think rarely has a conflict also shown it to be so true that the enemy of an enemy could be your friend. It's very confusing, the different alliances that we're seeing being developed here relating to what's happening in Syria. One more thing to pull up to show you here. Shoshana in Israel just sent us this video through worldhaveyoursay.com. Let's have a look at what she says.
I don't see that either side would really want to drag Israel into a war. I can't see that being good for either. I don't think they have the resources, nor truthfully, I don't think that's what they're fighting over. Is it spilling into Israel? Well, yesterday a group of Syrians tried to come into Israel to escape the fighting. They tried to come into the Golan Heights, and I know that the soldiers, the IDF, checked them out, made sure they were okay, and then when they assessed that the situation in Quneitra was no longer life-threatening, they sent them back. We have people from Lebanon, from the Lebanese wars, who are already here, second generation, but of course, unfortunately, we can't take in all the people of Syria. I do hope that it ends soon. I don't see that it ends soon unless, someone decides they don't need the power and control. Wouldn't that be a first in history?
Shoshana, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's shift from her video. By the way, if you ever want to upload your own video, worldhaveyoursay.com is where you can do it. It's incredibly easy to do. Now, back to the World's Newsroom, because we could speak to Rafid from BBC Arabic, also Sheriff from BBC Turkish. Let's talk about the role the countries which you broadcast to want to play in the future, starting with Turkey. It's not been interested in any sort of military involvement yet. Do you think that might change?
Well, actually, that's a very delicate situation in Turkey, and that's a very delicate question, because so far Erdogan has openly said that Turkey has been providing logistical support to Syria. And when he was questioned about this in May, just recently, actually a couple of weeks ago in May, he said that he agreed that that Turkey is providing logistical support, but it's not the same thing as getting involved militarily. Now, there has been a lot of protests, even when last year when a Turkish jet was shot down and Turkish parliament passed a motion to authorize the government to launch cross-border operations, people had taken to social media and to streets in some cities asking Turkey not to get involved in this war. So it would be a very delicate situation. It's always been a very delicate situation, Turkey getting involved militaristically. However, of course, logistically and in terms of accepting asylum seekers, that is still going on. But Erdogan at this stage would probably not take a military step or a harsh step at
Sheriff,
this stage.
thank you very much. Tell Rafid to hold his thought, because we're going to take a quick break here on World Have Your Say, but I'll come back to you straight after that break. Ian is a former British soldier. He's just called up from Germany to say, I'm ashamed about Syria. The international community should intervene. Whether there's an appetite for troops on the ground in the way that we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq at the moment, there certainly doesn't seem to be. More comments come in from Greece, Nepal, Sudan, South Africa. Keep them coming. I'll do my best to work them in. We've got a few more minutes left here on World Have Your Say. We're live. Let's take a break, then we'll be back.
No, I talking about it. Tim, let me say something.
We'll find out a lot about how much the world cares about the situation in Syria when we look at how it responds to the latest UN appeal. You may have seen this in the news. The UN is the largest ever appeal of its kind, wants $5 billion to help 10 million Syrians. It says 1/2 of all Syrians will need some form of humanitarian assistance by the end of this year. That is the scale of the conflict we're looking at. And as ever on World Have You Say, we talk about it so often, we're looking at the crucial elements of it and how best the world should respond to it. Let's go back now to our colleagues in the World Newsroom. Rafid's with us from BBC Arabic. This issue of arming the rebels keeps coming up again and again and again. Do you see a shift in the politicians in Arabic countries on this issue?
Well, not exactly. The Gulf countries, I mean, I'm talking about what the allegations of the Syrian regime and supporters has always accused Arab regimes like Qatar and Saudi Arabia particularly of arming the opposition in one way or another. So this has been on the table for long. If I may add something about the counter argument, if you like, or the counter allegation on the Hezbollah's recent intervention in Syria, when you have a participant, when you talk to people from the Middle East, especially Shiite people or Shiite sympathizers or supporters of the Assad regime, they would always indicate or imply to the other intervention, the Sunni intervention, if you like, the Sunni groups and also the Sunni countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and even Turkey, which is sometimes perceived as a Sunni country, especially with its AK party in government. So that's what you get most likely when you talk to a Shiite average person from that region. And also one event quickly that was overshadowed by Al-Qusayr, which was very important in my opinion. Only yesterday there was an audio message from the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri, and he endorsed Jabhat al-Nusra, the fundamentalist group in Syria, which is now very strong on the ground, and called it not to care for or to avoid sectarianism in Syria and focus on fighting the regime. A kind of interesting message that you wouldn't get from a person on that position.
Both of you, thank you very much for your help today. Live with us from the World's Newsroom. Now, let me pull up another video to show you here. Senator John McCain's been speaking, and he's been taking a keen interest in this conflict. He's been talking about why he thinks that it is possible to go about an effective intervention into Syria. Have a look.
No one should think that we have to destroy every defense system or put thousands of boots on the ground to make a difference in Syria. We have limited options. We could use our standoff weapons, such as cruise missiles, to target Assad's aircraft and ballistic missile launchers on the ground. We could enable a provisional government to establish itself in a safe zone in Syria that we could help to protect with Patriot missiles. And we could organize a full-scale operation to train and equip Syrian opposition forces.
John McCain talking about training and equipping forces. We've heard that before with plans in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our three guests, Elizabeth in Israel, Kenan on the Syrian-Turkish border, and also Diana in Beirut. Do you like what John McCain is suggesting? Elizabeth, you first. Elizabeth, can you hear me okay? Doesn't sound like it. In the meantime, Kenan, I'll ask you the same question. What John McCain is suggesting, does it appeal?
Yes, I mean, John McCain's position is one which will result in the long term and in the short term in the protection of the lives of Syrian civilians, and will create a military situation on the ground which can induce a real political dialogue. So long as the Assad regime has unlimited support from Russia and Iran and Hezbollah on the ground and with weapons, there will be no hope for a real political dialogue to bring all the parties to the table. And what John McCain is suggesting, bringing the Syrian opposition inside Syria and protecting them with Patriot missiles and taking out the Assad regime's aircraft and ballistic missile capabilities, will create that scenario on the ground from where we can have a real political transition.
But you are quite right. It's hard to imagine any of that happening unless Russia shifts its position. Diana, a quick word from you. Would you like American intervention, as John McCain suggests?
I would like to see international intervention, not American ones, but there are lots of ways to interpret what is international intervention. I think a no-fly zone is something should be considered. I know it was refused in the past, but this is something that could work really good for the Syrian opposition. Yes, I understand the concern of arming the Syrian opposition, but at the same time that Russians and Iranians are not stopping arming the Syrian regime. So there are lots of ways. I'm not a military expert, but I think, yes, the international community should play a role. Yes, we should support the opposition. There are lots of ways. Arming this opposition is not the only way.
And I suppose, but the point is we should make is that you're right, that Russia is not stopping it happening. Actually, many countries have their own concerns. That's what's stopping them doing it at the moment. Diana, good to speak to you. Kenan, thank you very much. Faisal from BBC Monitoring. Now, a couple of other things to mention. We put all of the video content that we produce here on World Have Your Say on our YouTube channel. That includes all of our TV editions here on BBC World News. One of the latest things we've put up there is a Google Hangout that we did with the BBC's arts editor, Will Gompertz. If you'd like to see that, go to our Google Plus page or go to our YouTube page and let us know if you'd like to take part in future Hangouts. One other thing to mention, we're going to be live on BBC World Service Radio in an hour's time, talking about that story coming out of the States. Some agencies accused of collecting phone data from a big phone operator and tapping servers belonging to companies like Google. We'll be discussing that live, and you can stream it at bbcworldservice.com. That's it for this edition, though, here on BBC World News. Thank you very much for your contributions. Speak to you next week. Bye-bye.